So let's talk about life out west. We've talked a little bit before about manifest destiny, and my slides aren't straight. There we go. Okay, we've talked a little bit about manifest destiny, and this painting in particular, sort of being the idea of America bringing civilization, aka democracy, aka the light, to the wilderness. We see this idea of manifest destiny, the belief that not only um, can America expand, but they should expand. That it is a right to expand. Lewis and Clark really help to advance this idea when they go through the Louisiana Territory and do all the different discoveries of flora and fauna and native peoples and animals and whatnot, traversing rivers. It brings excitement, right? It brings excitement to this idea of exploring, in some ways, a brand new world, going into the frontier. So we see more people beginning to move out west. They move into Texas, they get into the Midwest, and of course, eventually into the Northwest. Federal government policy and the transcontinental railroads both encouraged the agricultural development of the Trans-Mississippi West. The Homestead Act of 1862 provided 160 basically free acres to the head of a family who resided on the land for 5 years. The land could also be acquired after only 6 months for $1.25 an acre. Now, although the price was right, small farms were not very efficient because of the conditions on the Great Plains. Under the Timber Culture Act of 1873, homesteaders could increase their holdings and acquire an additional 160 acres if they agreed to plant and maintain trees on part of that land. The Desert Land Act of 1877 gave farmers an additional 640 acres at $1.25 an acre if the land was irrigated within 3 years. Many settlers still preferred to buy land from the railroads, which had received millions of acres through federal land grants. There was no limit on the amount of land that could be purchased, and the proximity to the railroads gave settlers ready access to the markets in the east. Settlers did quickly realize that the plains did not yield crops as readily as land in the east. Necessary but expensive aspects of agriculture on the Great Plains included dry farming, which involved plowing deeply for moisture and then breaking up the soil surface to catch and hold any precipitation that might fall. Dry farming required a heavy reliance on agricultural machinery, like the improved steel plows, threshing, haymaking machines, seed drills, and used windmills to pump water from deep underground. Another important innovation was barbed wire, which was patented in 1874, and this allowed farmers to fence their fields in a region where timber was in fairly short supply, and it would help keep cattle from trampling their crops. The average farm in the West was no larger than those in other regions of the country, sometimes twice the acreage. In the 1870s, so-called bonanza farms were established in the wheat-growing northern plains. Ranging from 1,000 to over 10,000 acres, they were highly mechanized and relied on a large number of laborers to bring in a single crop. Although most disappeared by the 1890s, the bonanza farms were symbolic of the trend toward large-scale agriculture that began in the West. Bringing new lands under cultivation and widespread use of machinery led to a tremendous increase in farm production. The wheat crop, which became an export staple, grew from 170 million bushels at the end of the Civil War to more than 700 million bushels by the close of the century. Overproduction in the U.S. and expanded crop production in Argentina, Australia, Canada, and Russia drove agricultural prices down during the same period. Unfortunately, American farmers did not seem to understand how the market operated. When prices fell, their inclination was to plant more, which added to the worldwide surplus, and of course is not going to help them with their money problems, right? Whoops. The promise of wealth through agriculture failed to materialize for most settlers in the West. They borrowed heavily to buy their land and equipment, and as prices continued to fall, they were unable to pay their debts. Foreclosures and the number of tenant farmers steadily increased in the late 19th century, particularly on the Great Plains. Farmers typically blamed their plight on others, specifically the railroads and the government. They blamed the railroads for continuously raising and charging very high shipping rates, and the federal government for keeping the supply of money tight by adhering to the gold standard. And we have a group of people known as the progressives who come out during this time, and they are really advocating for a currency based on silver, but also for more paper money in circulation. By the end of the 19th century, the West was effectively settled. Railroads stretched across all parts of the region, from the Great Northern, which ran along the Canadian border, to the Southern Pacific that ran across Texas and the Arizona and New Mexico territories to link New Orleans and Los Angeles. The influx of homesteaders, ranchers, and miners swelled the census rolls and led to the admission of Nevada, Colorado, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming as states. New towns and cities created by the cattle or mining boom, such as Abilene, Denver, and San Francisco, also dotted the trans-Mississippi West. Under President Andrew Jackson, Native American tribes from the southeast had been resettled in what became Oklahoma. Long considered remote and unproductive, Oklahoma land became increasingly valuable. And by the 1880s, the federal government was under pressure to open it to non-natives for settlement. Congress responded by putting 2 million acres of the Indian Territory into public domain. At noon on April 22, 1889, more than 50,000 people, popularly known as the Boomers, arrived on horseback, or came in wagons, and some even rode on bicycles, and they stampeded into what is now central Oklahoma to stake out their claims. Within a few hectic hours, all the available land was settled, with the choicest acreage actually going to the Sooners, people who crossed the line before the official beginning of the land rush. An additional 6 million acres in the Oklahoma Panhandle, called the Cherokee Strip, was open for settlers toward the end of the century. A year after the Oklahoma land rush, the director of the U.S. Census Bureau announced that the frontier was closed. The 1890 census showed that frontier line, a point beyond which the population density was less than 2 people per square mile, no longer existed. With more people homesteading farms after 1890 than in the decades before, the Western experience was far from over. But with the approach of the new century, there was a new appreciation of the environment and the scenic values of the West. As the frontier officially disappeared, popular interest in preserving wilderness grew. Although Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming was established in 1872, California's Yosemite was the first national park specifically designed to protect a wilderness area. In 1891, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act, authorizing the president to close timber areas to settlement and create national forests by withdrawing the land from the public domain. President Benjamin Harrison immediately set aside 13 million acres under the legislation. Naturalist John Muir, who was a driving force behind the creation of Yosemite, founded the Sierra Club in 1892 to protect the Pacific Coast's mountain ranges. For all the preservation sentiment, there were also trends developing that emphasized more fully utilizing the resources of the West. The 20th century's large-scale irrigation projects, dams, aqueducts, and power lines that would bring water and electricity hundreds of miles to the region's major cities would ultimately transform the West in ways that could not be imagined in 1890. So this is sort of our turning point and our bridge into our discussion of the Progressive era. That is where we'll pick up next time.